All right. So, welcome to a new module where we are going to continue our discussion of or on the diversity of life. Um, we've talked about microbes, so prokaryotes, and we started diving into eukaryotes, and we talked about protists. We went over fungi, and then the last groupings that we need to discuss are plants, which is going to be the focus of this module. And then the next module is going to be animals. All right. So, plants. Plants are super important for our ecosystems and for all living organisms that um, interact with plants in some way, and usually that's pretty much going to be everything, if you think about it, because plants can affect the climate. So, for example, you can get microclimates where a tree will shade the soil and allow the soil to be cooler than if the soil was not in the shade. And that microclimate can be very important for certain species to be able to exist. Also, if you have a really large forest, you can get a lot of evapotranspiration from the trees, and that can affect the humidity and the climate for that region. Trees and vegetation are also important for shaping the Earth's terrain because the roots will hold the soil in place. They prevent erosion, and they help to kind of reduce the rates of erosion. Whenever you remove forest and vegetation from the landscape, you tend to get really dusty areas because there's nothing to hold that soil in place anymore, and the wind can blow and pick that dust up. So if you live in the Central Valley or around ag areas, you may notice that whenever those fields aren't planted, it could be really dusty during those times because the wind is blowing that topsoil off the surface. And then finally, a use for vegetation and plants are the resources that they can give us. They allow us to obtain food, medicine. We make clothing from plant material. We build from plant material. We get energy from plant-based material, whether it's wood or it's organic matter that has formed peat or coal over millions of years. And so plants are super important, not only for the interactions that they have with their environment, but also for the ecosystem services and the resources that they allow us to obtain. Now, in looking at the evolution of plants, they came from a water based ancestor, aquatic based ancestor that eventually evolved to take advantage of the terrestrial habitats. And so we're going to kind of follow that pathway of evolution as we kind of take a tour across plant diversity. In terms of the number of species of plants that exist, there's approximately 300,000 species or so. Most of those plants are photosynthetic species, meaning they are autotrophs, but there are several plants that are parasitic and lost their ability to photosynthesize. But then there are also plants that can do a combination of both. So they are heterotrophic as well as photosynthetic. And then you have some plants like your Venus flytrap and your pitcher plants that will capture other organisms and actually obtain organic materials and molecules through the digestion of those organisms via enzymes that are in the plants. Most of the plant species produce seeds, but seeds is not an ancestral trait of plants. Seeds are a derived trait that basically arose in the more recent groupings of plants that we'll talk about at the end, towards the end of this lecture. And those groupings are the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. Now, all plants have cell walls, Most of them will reproduce sexually. A lot of plants can reproduce asexually. And then plants also have what's called indeterminate growth. So basically, they have no final body size or body form. So they basically can grow as tall as their resources allow, as tall as their structure allows. They can get, as big as their environment will allow them to get. And so they continue to grow and make biomass until they die and are then recycled back into the environment. Now we said that plants adapted from this aquatic to terrestrial lifestyle. Now there are some challenges that are associated with that switch. One of the obvious challenges is that when you move onto the land in the terrestrial environments, you no longer have access to water all of the time. And so plants had to evolve mechanisms to prevent their structures from drying out. And they also had to prevent ways to provide, or they had to evolve ways to generate structural support because the air does not give buoyancy to their structures like the water does. And so because of this, they had to, obtain rigid structures that allowed them to grow upright and also to grow taller. And they had to evolve structures that allowed them to move nutrients and water throughout the plant itself. Also, the sperm in earlier plants are not able to move unless they were in a water layer or a water film. So the sperm would swim to the eggs. And what that means is that as you get into these terrestrial environments, you now have to figure out how you can reproduce without your sperm constantly relying on a water source to swim to and fertilize the eggs. And then you also have to find ways to prevent your eggs and sperm from drying out. Again, which is a big problem because you're not 100% tied to the soil or to the water. Now, benefits that are associated with this transition from water to land is that there was this just tremendous amount of open space and have and an area that was available for the plants to colonize. There's also much more sunlight, and you don't have that sunlight attenuation like you do in the water column. And there's also much more CO2 in the atmosphere than what's dissolved in the water column itself. So they have access to more CO2 for photosynthesis, which means they can put more biomass, have more productivity, and they have more sunlight to drive that photosynthetic process. And so if you're an organism that focuses on photosynthesis as your energy generating source, then you want to photosynthesize as much as you can. It just makes sense to be able to do that. And so those are the two big benefits that you get from moving from that aquatic to terrestrial environment. And so the way plants evolve to deal with these, disadvantages of the terrestrial habitat is that one, they underwent this alternation of generation lifestyle. And so basically with plants, you have two generations that exist within a single individual life cycle. The first generation, or I shouldn't say the first, but one generation is called the sporophyte generation. The sporophyte is a diploid individual, meaning that it has two copies of a chromosome. And the other generation that exists in this alternation of generations is the gametophyte. And the gametophyte is the haploid portion of the life cycle. And we can talk about the different stages of the life cycles based on whether or not they are diploid dominant or haploid dominant. So what we mean by dominant is if you go out on the landscape and you see a plant growing, and that plant stays in that portion of the life cycle for a majority of the time, that's the dominant portion of the life cycle. So a plant can be, the haploid version can be the dominant portion, and that would be referred to as a haplontic life cycle. If the plant is diploid for a majority of its cycle, then that plant is referred to as a diplontic life cycle. And so examples of these, a diplontic life cycle would be a conifer tree or a flower. The individual that you see growing most of the time is haploid. The only portion of a flower that is diploid is the pollen and the egg. And so the actual structures that are growing are diploid, and so a flower has a diplontic life cycle. Now, a moss, the organism that you see growing, is part of the haploid life cycle. And so a moss has a haplontic life cycle. And so this figure will hopefully clarify what we mean by these two different stages. So you have a haploid stage that you see here, 1N, meaning one copy of the chromosome. And remember, that is the gametophyte. So here you have spores that only have one copy of the chromosome. They will generate into a gametophyte, and that gametophyte under mitosis still has one copy. And then you can have two gametes to fuse together to form a zygote. And so this could be fertilization as well. So now that zygote has two copies because two gametes with one copy each fuse together of chromosomes. And then that zygote will grow through the process of mitosis into the sporophyte. The sporophyte is a part of the plant that has two copies of the chromosome. And then the sporophyte will undergo meiosis to reduce those numbers of the number of copies back to one, and will generate spores that are haploid. And so you have this alternation of generations where you go from the gametophyte stage to the sporophyte stage back to the gametophyte stage. And the haplontic and diplontic basically says the sporophyte is the dominant stage for diplontic, or the gametophyte is the dominant stage for the haplontic. Okay. So here we have two more examples of life history stages where we have a diplontic dominant or gametophyte dominant stage, which is a moss. And then we have a diplontic or sporophyte dominant fern. And now the reason we say they're dominant is because the moss is the structure that's actually growing, and the moss structure that's growing here is haploid. The sporophyte structure grows out of that haploid individual and actually gets all of its nutrients from the gametophyte. So the sporophyte is gametophyte dependent. And so the sporophyte cannot grow unless the gametophyte's present. And in a moss, that sporophyte will have a capsule that will hold the spores, and that capsule will burst and it will release the spores that will then germinate into into a gametophyte adult that will then grow another sporophyte and release those spores. So the sporophyte in this case is only a small portion of the moss life cycle, and that's just really the reproductive stage. Whereas for the fern, the sporophyte is the actual fern body that you see growing, and on the underneath of the leaves on the ferns, the sporophyte, you'll see these sori, which are little areas of spores that are haploid, and those spores are really the only haploid portion of the life cycle. Those spores, or I'm sorry, the spores will grow into the gametophyte which is the haploid portion of the life cycle. The gametophyte for ferns are very small, like we see here. And on that gametophyte, there's actually a male and female structure. The male structure will release the sperm. The female structure contains the egg. The sperm will swim to the egg, will fertilize and create a zygote that will then grow into a large fern plant. And so that's the difference again between the sporophyte dominant and the gametophyte dominant life cycles. Now, the sporophyte itself will contain sporangia, which are spores that are intervessel. And so, for example, this is the sporangia on the moss. Okay. And then the spores are also known as sporocytes. And the sporocytes will develop haploid spores via meiosis, and it will basically reduce the chromosome number by half. And then the spores will be released and develop into the gametophyte. The gametophyte will have what's called male or female gametangia. So here for the moss, you have female gametangia, male gametangia, which are known as antheridial or archegonial heads. Okay. So arch is the female and anther is the male. Within depending on the species of the plant, it can produce one of two spore types. So if the spores are the same size, then they are referred to as homosporous. So for example, excuse me, for example, here, these spores are the same size, so it's known as homosporous. You could also be heterosporous if those spores are two different sizes. So microspores and megaspores. An example of this is, say, the pollen and eggs of a gymnosperm. The pollen are very tiny, the eggs are much larger, and so that is an example of a heterosporous individual. So they have two types of spores. They have male spores and female spores. Another adaptation for land plants is that or are the gametangia that we see in seedless plants. Okay, so these plants here that have the spores are seedless plants. So ferns and mosses and bryophytes and lycophytes, all of those plants are seedless individuals, and they have the gametangia, and those gametangia are what produce the gametes, the male and the female reproductive structures that we were talking about in the previous slide. And so again, the gametes, like when we were talking in the meiosis lecture, are those haploid reproductive cells. Okay? And there are many different types of seedless plants that produce sperm with flagella that have to swim to the female gametangia in moist environments. And an example of that are the mosses that we were just looking at. Now, a fourth adaptation that plants have for terrestrial environments is what's called an apical meristem. And we can see that apical meristem here in this figure. So you basically have a plant that's growing upright. And so if we look in between these two leaves here, there would be an apical meristem down there. And that apical meristem not only grows on the tips of stems, and so which is also known as shoots, but it also will grow at the tip of a root. And the apical meristem contains these specialized cells called meristematic cells that will differentiate and develop into various tissues of the plants. So it will develop into maybe xylem or phloem or leaf tissue, stem tissue, etc. And it allows the plants to grow upward and to grow downward into the soils so that they can obtain resources, so that they can gather more sunlight, or that they can uptake more water and minerals that are in the soil layers. And so those are basically kind of the four major adaptations for plants, but there are also a variety of other adaptations that terrestrial plants have that allow them to be successful in those terrestrial environments. One is that you have early plants, growing only a few inches above the ground. So this meant that they had to compete for sunlight because they were kind of bunched together, not really growing taller to gain access to increase the availability of sunlight. And so the development of shoots allowed them to grow taller and to outcompete those plants that only growed lower to the ground for sunlight. But growing taller means that they have to generate rigid molecules to support that tall growth. So they form what's known as a vascular system. And this vascular system allows water to go up through the xylem and phloem to carry glucose down into the roots. And so basically what happens is water will be carried up to the leaves where it will be used for photosynthesis, and then organic sugar molecules, carbohydrates, will be made. And then those carbohydrates, mainly glucose, will then be carried down to the roots of the plant where it will be stored until they're needed for growth. Another adaptation is a cuticle. So you have this cuticle that allows leaves to be more selective on how much water they actually lose. So cuticles serve as this waterproofing mechanism, and then you add openings in this waterproofing that can be closed and opened at any time, and that then controls when the plant is losing water. And so as the stomata are open, that allows carbon dioxide to go into the leaf, and water will evaporate out as a product of that happening. And so they can minimize how much water is lost by determining how open those stomata are. They can leave them open or they can close them. But if the stomata are closed, they also are not taking up CO2. So there's a trade-off with that. Plants have also developed toxic chemicals that can prevent herbivory, so prevent them from being consumed. And then they also have evolved a variety of different attractive structures that will attract pollinators so that they can ensure reproduction outside of water, so that they can ensure that the pollen will be brought to the eggs, the ovaries, and so that fertilization, that pollination process can happen even though the plants are growing outside of water. All right. So this does it for the first portion of the module, where we're basically went through and did an overview of plants, evolution of plants and their adaptations. Next, what we're going to look at are the major division of land plants. And so we're going to pretty much break it up into non-vascular plants and vascular plants that have seeds. And so we'll kind of go through that over the next couple videos, kind of following the evolution of plants from these more primitive terrestrial variants to more adapted or higher adapted, I guess you could say. Maybe that's not the correct way to say it, but more recently evolved seed plants, like your gymnosperms and your angiosperms. And so with that, we will see you in the next video.